Okay. Okay. Welcome back. Okay, are we back, all of us? Good afternoon. We can start now. Right. Okay. So we're talking about accountability and the framework of accountability that have gone into a little bit of a kind of a mutation, right? Talking about the movement of vertical accountability to horizontal accountability. Vertical accountability to horizontal accountability. This is what we have seen, right? And this is marked, for example, by the most radical transformation at the level of governance transparency is RTI 2005. Right to information is something that every child knows today to some extent, and it is one of the most potent tools in the hands of the citizens to extract direct accountability from the public administration. Okay, let me for example give you an instance of how this works, so you get the concept clarified in your minds. Let's say you have, for example, let's say this is a public office. Okay, let's assume that this is a public office, and now let's say this office is in the public office. This is a public office. This office is in the, what you can call, in the business of, or in the administration of developing bridges. Developing bridges, but it's creating bridges from, over the rivers for the government, and it's a government office, right? Now let's say, for example, it had taken a contract of developing a bridge over a river which is flowing underneath it. Okay, this is a contract, or not a contract, but this this department itself is involved in creating the bridge. It has a civil engineers, everything. So this department is involved in creating the bridge. Now it has been 7 years since the construction of the bridge started, and the construction is not yet complete. Okay, it has been 7 years since the construction of the bridge started, and it is not yet complete. So the question is asked whether the department is doing its job or not. Right now, let's say, for example, if you're speculating that there is some kind of a corruption, or there is some kind of incompetence, or there is some other thing which is happening, some kind of a mala fide which is happening in the background, which is deliberately keeping the bridge from being constructed, and the money which has been coming, which is coming from the government of India, or let's say the government of state, for the development of this bridge is being siphoned off, right? So let's say, as a citizen, I start speculating what is wrong, what is right. Now my speculations are not going to be enough for me to understand clearly what has gone right or wrong. So what I would do is, I would ask this public office as to what is the nature or the status of the construction of the bridge. How far is the bridge still remaining to be constructed? How much money has been spent on it? What is the team which is working for it, etc., etc. You see, this is a question that I would want to ask to this. Let's say if I have an answer to this question, I could actually go to the public and tell, see, so much money has been spent on the development of the bridge, but in reality the bridge has not been constructed at all, right? Or the master plan of the bridge shows that so much construction has happened, but there is no bridge on the road, like a proverbial thing which happens in India in terms of the, you know, inefficiency by the government sometimes, right? So the point is, how does the bridge get constructed, and how the public administration over here can be held accountable for something like this. Now, previously, for example, let's say if you had to get information like this as to how the bridge was being constructed, or what are the ways in which this bridge is, you know, working together with the agenda which has been given to him, the citizen could not directly ask for any information from the public office. What the citizen had to do was, take a look at this, he has to follow the long arc of accountability. The citizen, along with the group of citizens, will have to create a kind of a group, let's say for example a small pressure group, which would go to their local member of parliament, let's say, okay, and ask him to ask him to find a way through this public office or public administration department which is not working can be made accountable. If the local member of parliament takes a look at their application, he can then go into the parliament, and in the parliament he can have what you can call a question hour, right? There's a hour in the parliament known as the question hour, and in the question hour he can ask a question. For example, what is the status of this bridge which is being developed for the last 7 years in this district? Once the question hour is given to a minister, the minister, for example, you have the PWD minister, right? Now PWD minister will take this question and then get the information from his department about the nature of this bridge, supply this information to the parliament, and then the information will get to the citizen, right? This is like a proto RTI. The question hour is sometimes also referred to as the proto RTI. Before there was RTI, it was the question hour which was the only way by which you can get information such as this from the government of India, which is a kind of a reflection or what you can call indication of how the accountability and transparency structures worked before the 2005 RTI Act, or before the 1990s, when there was no movement of transparency and accountability in India. Clear? So we're taking a look at this particular aspect about how the government of India is taking decisions and taking construction projects, etc., but it may not be delivering upon them. So this kind of an arc of accountability is what we see happening with that regard, mostly and importantly. But now what happens within RTI is that you don't have to go through this entire process. Okay, this huge process for ensuring accountability, this arc of accountability, can be completely cut through, and you can go directly to the public office under the RTI. You see, so you see, this is what is vertical, and this is horizontal. This is what we are dealing with in terms of the transformation of accountability that has happened in these areas. Okay, vertical accountability and horizontal accountability. Clear? Right? Okay. So this is one thing that we can take a look at in terms of understanding. Clear? The second thing we can talk about with regard to Weberian features, which was there, it goes like this. If I can draw a kind of a pyramid on this, this is like a Weberian, neat hierarchy. Okay, you have vertical accountability, then you have monopoly over information, this is what I'm going to explain to you now, and then there is centralization. This was a structure of governance created on the lines of Max Weber's bureaucracy, which eventually was also adopted by India later on. Now, this entire structure of what you can say governance is undergoing a massive transformation. Okay, because a kind of a little bit of a crisis has hit this structure of governance. This structure of governance has not been able to sustain itself with the Indian experience. And therefore, what we are seeing is that in place of vertical accountability, what is coming out is horizontal accountability. In place of monopoly over information, what is coming out is transparency. And in place of centralization, what is coming out is decentralization. You see the point? This is the point that we are taking a look at. When a crisis hits a system, it is bound to change or mutate, and the changes of this is what we can call the old model of governance. Let me just write it down here properly. This is the old model of governance, which was very bureaucratic in nature. That is why the Weberian term bureaucracy was applied to it. And this is the new model of governance, also known as the model of good governance. And this is the transformation that we are witnessing in India. For example, with RTI, Citizens Charter, Lokpal, Lokayat, the Prevention of Corruption Act, CBI, CVC, all these agencies, we are a part of this kind of a transformation in India today. Clear? Just take a look at these. If you want to draw it out properly, it's a nice infographic that you can attach with your answers to give a sense of what we're talking about. Okay, let me give you an understanding of what I mean to say by monopoly over information. Monopoly over information. Okay, now what we understand with this is basically this. Let's say, for example, imagine a situation in which, let's say if this is a river which is running in a particular region, okay, and this is the most important source of water for this area. Now let's imagine this river is polluted. There are some very clear pollutants in this river, right? And also this river is being used by the area for drawing on its most important water drinking resources. Okay, now here's, let's say for example, a plant which has been attached at the side of the river, which takes the water from the river and it supplies the water by treating it to the homes of people. Clear? And this plant is managed by the government of India. The government of India is the manager of the plant over here. Clear? So the question that we are asking is, let's say this, if it is the year 1975, if one has to find out whether this particular part of the river is polluted or not, okay, let's say if there are rumors that there is some kind of a toxic chemical in the river because of some industrial waste which has been released into the river. Now, if this kind of a speculation or rumor has to be evidentiated, this kind of a data collection, the information collection of whether and to what extent the river is polluted cannot be done by anyone apart from the government of India or the government of the state, because only they would have the instruments of doing it. No other organization or agency in the country which is a privately led agency or organization can ever have the instruments by which it can conduct a kind of a inquiry as to whether a particular, what you can call, river or any information about that river can be taken up. They don't have the apparatus. They will never have the machinery, the mechanisms by which they could actually use that information, because the government is the largest controller of everything in 1975. Only the government of India can have the apparatus. Now, it is possible that the government of India can take a look at the water and can measure the toxicity of the water and can have the information within itself, but the government may not release it to the people, because then the people would say that if this river is so toxic, why is the government still using this water to supply us our drinking facilities? And also, why doesn't government make other arrangements, or let's say why doesn't the government punish the people who are guilty for releasing all this toxicity into the river? You see the point? So the idea is that the government may have this kind of information. In fact, the only organization in the country that can have this kind of information is the government. The only organization in the country which can have this kind of information is the government, because they will have the instruments and the mechanisms, etc., for tracing this kind of a data. Clear? In 1975. And this way the government is becoming the primary site. Okay, take a look at this. The government becomes the primary site at which information, government becomes the primary site at which information is collected and stored. Right? Think of something like a census exercise, right? A census exercise is a exercise by which you do a head count of the people of India and put them under a proper registration. Now, the government obviously can be the only organization which can carry out a massive endeavor like a census, because government departments are spread across the entire country. It has its tentacles everywhere. It can convert the government departments to carry out the sanctions, right? So the question which is in this regard about there being a particular activity being done by the government can, in terms of creating and generating and transmitting information, is giving government what is known as monopoly over information. It has given government monopoly over information. Clear? How did this monopoly over information kind of a thing started ending? Let's say, for example, in 1975, you turn the clock a little forward and come to 2022. If, let's say, the city in which I live in, the city of New Delhi, is known for its toxic air quality during the winter seasons, and the stubble burning around the areas, and many factors come together to compound the problem of smog in New Delhi, which is an unbearable sight. The PM 2.5 or PM 5.0, these particles, what is the concentration of these particles in the air, if it is not today released by the government, can easily be collected by a private individual, because now the, what you can call, the machinery and the mechanisms which are needed to collect information, okay, please pay attention to what I'm saying. The machinery and the mechanisms which are needed to collect information today can be as easily accessed by private individuals as they can be by the government. You see, you can just go and buy it from a market, and this has obviously happened because of the liberalization of economy, the relaxation on import, and also a lot of scientific development within India, which can create all kinds of instruments which are at least at par with what the government has or maybe superior to them. You see the point? So, in terms of collecting information, the government and the private individuals, the civil society, what we call it, has come at par with each other. They're not in a distinction with each other. They are at the same level with each other in terms of being able to generate and store information. And if the government does not want to give information on a certain thing, it is the private parties which can give information upon that certain thing. Right? And this kind of a thing has forced, again, the same idea that the monopoly over information could not be sustained by the government anymore, and therefore it has been converted to what is known as transparency. This is what transparency means, that the government is now not the only or the primary site of generating data, storing data and transmitting data. Non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, self-help groups, all of these have abilities, even private individuals have abilities to collect this kind of a data. And therefore the government is forced now to also release its own data and make it a part of a common public knowledge, so that the government and the civil society can work in tandem with each other, in association with each other, rather than the government trying to hide away the information from the civil society. Right? So government can use the information the civil society has, the civil society can use the information the government has, and this can come together into doing something effective. This was very clearly seen during the COVID-19 times, when a lot of civil society organizations had organized a lot of activities, and they had given the government feedback about COVID control measures and how to deal with the virus and how to organize rallies and campaigns to make people aware about the protocols to be followed under the COVID-19. So you had seen this kind of this is the point, right? You have in verticals, you have like this movement that we cannot touch the public administration. Only the superiors of the public administration can touch the public administration. Now what you have is that in every district, in every city, in every panchayat, you have the public administrators and the people now interacting and collaborating with each other. This is what is known as good governance. This is the idea of democracy in terms of governance, right? It was a French writer, Pierre Roosevelt, who wrote a book by the title of Good Governance, which became the basis of what is known as the concept of good governance. Let me show you what this means for us. Now, this is a book which is one of the recent masterpieces in terms of getting you the concept of good government. It's a French author which gave the concept of good government, and the subtitle of this is Democracy Beyond Elections, which means that people's participation in the formation of government is not sufficient. People's participation in the activities of governance is also equally important. So elections happen once in 5 years at different levels, but after the elections are over, people cannot just rest and let the political parties take in charge of the things. They have to constantly work towards getting their societies and areas better off by introducing concepts of good governance, etc., etc. Right? So you see this kind of a thing which became in the question of what you were asking some time back. Good government. What does good government mean? Democracy beyond elections. That's the point about something that you can call good governance. It's given as a subtitle over there. You see the point? Right? So, monopoly over information also translated into what is known as transparency. Right? This kind of a movement was very significantly seen. And the third movement that we have seen is centralization to decentralization. Okay, for example, one of the ways in which we can understand this movement very clearly and very easily is how the, let's say, for example, you have the, let's divide, for example, the way in which schemes are implemented in India. This is, let's say, for example, this is the Planning Commission. Okay, and let's say these are the states. Let's say this is the state of Uttar Pradesh, this is the state of Bihar, this is the state of Madhya Pradesh, this is the state of West Bengal, this is the state of Kerala, this is the state of Tamil Nadu. Okay, this is a Planning Commission. Now let's say, for example, if all of these states have a problem, let's call it malnutrition. What the Planning Commission would do at the center is that it would make a central plan upon malnutrition as to how to the Planning Commission would make a central plan upon malnutrition, which would mean as to how, for example, the Planning Commission could find ways to solve malnutrition. And this central plan, it will implement in all the states uniformly. Okay, in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in UP, in Bihar, in MP, and West Bengal. A similar standard uniform plan to root out the problems of malnutrition can be taken out from the central authority. So what was happening was that the Planning Commission was giving money to these states and a plan to these states, and the states had become merely the implementation agencies of these plans on the money, and on top of that the state governments had to add their own money also to some extent. You see, so the question, the point about this was that not only were the state governments not allowed to give their own ideas and inputs about how to solve malnutrition in their particular states, but also the state governments were not allowed to, first the state governments had to take the plans from the central government, take some money from the central government and add some money on their own and execute the plans as made by the central government. Now the problem that started arising in this kind of a situation, the problem that started coming out in this kind of a situation was very simply this, that the reason for malnutrition in Uttar Pradesh could be very different from the reason of malnutrition in Bihar. You know, let's say, for example, I'll give you an instance. In one of the cases, when the government scheme was trying to, there was a government scheme which was trying to block, which was trying to, let's say, how should I say it? There was a government scheme which was trying to bring an end to malnutrition. It stated that the reason of malnutrition is the lack of ration which goes to the poor people, that poor people do not have enough to eat, so that there is a lack of ration. Okay, so the state government, central government started making a plan of giving rations, etc., etc. Now in some states this plan of uprooting malnutrition was properly implemented. It was actually getting results, but in some states, even after the provision of rations to the people, their calorie intake, etc., was still showing below the proper guidelines, proper benchmarks. Okay, then the kind of a curiosity arose in everyone as to what is happening, etc. And then later it was found out that in these particular states, the problem of malnutrition was not really because of what you can call the lack of food that they have. Food they have ample, but because of the lack of proper sanitation facilities, because of open defecation, the people of these regions are constantly subjected to pathogens, which leads them to diseases like dysentery and other cholera, etc., which does not let the food absorb inside their systems, and it starts flushing out because of the diseases, etc., etc. You see the point? So because of the exposure to pathogens, exposure to germs, the digestive system was getting weaker and it was not able to absorb nutrients from the food that they were eating. And then eventually the problem was not of the lack of food but the lack of public sanitation facilities. You see the point? So the plan obviously had put so much money inside this kind of a thing, but it was not able to solve problem because it was not taking any feedback from the local areas. Now local people were telling that we have enough food, we don't need food, but because the central government was singing, yeah, everyone needs more food and give everyone food, etc., they kind of made a centralized planning structure execute. Now this is one of the cases in which you can see the reason why a centralized planning structure could not be very efficiently successful in India. If you take a look at, for example, a problem like female infanticide, or a female like, or let's say a problem like honor killing, or a problem like child labor. Now, in different states and different regions in India, these problems exist. But in these different states and different regions, these problems can exist for different reasons. You see the point? In one state, you may have child labor because of one reason. In another state, you may have child labor because of another reason. Let's say, for example, in one state, it is actually, let's say, caste system is a reason for child labor. In another, it is, let's say, for example, the overall socio-economic backwardness of that area. So, to target these problems for a central authority becomes impossible because they do not know the complexities and the diversities which are existing at the ground level. You see the point? That the kind of what you can say, the ways in which the locals are familiar with the problems of themselves, central authorities sitting in New Delhi will not have an understanding. And this kind of a assertion by the central authority that we are going to make centralized planning structures and then create systems in which all these problems are going to be solved by the government schemes, this for India has not worked out very well. And therefore the new movement is something like this, that instead of giving, let's say for example, what this new movement states is that instead of giving a plan to the state of Bihar, you only give the money to the state of Bihar and give him some broad outlines. That's it. Just give him some broad basics about what it should achieve. But don't give it a micromanaged plan as to how it has to achieve it. And this kind of a thing came to be known as decentralization. I'm just giving you an example of decentralization by using the concept of fiscal federalism and the money which is coming from the union to the states under the centrally sponsored schemes, which we'll take a look at properly later on. But this is what we understand in pointed terms as decentralization, which allows for people to communicate with each other, or which allows the central government to communicate with the state governments in taking them into confidence and letting them take decisions upon their own issues by their own selves. Right? So this is again the third aspect of what the structure of governance and how it is changing in Indian context. Right? We are going from accountability in terms of vertical accountability to horizontal accountability, monopoly over information to transparency, and centralization to decentralization. This is how the three aspects of the Indian governance are being under a very clear transformation. It is our lifetime is one of the parts in which this transformation is supposed to be completed, and we are supposed to attain the goals of good governance. Right? And once we understand this kind of a structure, you see, about the conceptual framework, everything which are a part of this thing, okay, I will write it out again. You have the right to information, you have the citizens charter, Then you have the, let's say, Prevention of Corruption Act, you have the Lokpal, you have the Lokayat, you have the CBI, CVC, CIC, all these statutory bodies, and then you have the RTI, then you have e-governance. All of these things as individual items will be studied under the chapter of transparency and accountability, because all of them are nothing but instruments for achieving transparency and accountability. Transparency as a breakage of monopoly over information, and accountability as a way to hold people accountable for what they're doing by the citizens, not only by their superiors, right? The movement of vertical accountability to horizontal accountability, and the movement of monopoly over information to transparency, right? Okay. Okay, so what I'll do is at this point of time, before the notes in a way accumulate for us to write at one end, please start writing. I've done the conceptual framework part, and then I'll just move to transparency, which I've explained more or less to you. What does transparency mean in terms of the problem, which is the lack of transparency, is the monopoly over information by the government, which it can or cannot release to the people. And then we'll cover a little bit about the RTI today. All right, RTI or Citizen Charter, one of these things we'll try to cover today. Okay, so just please write a little bit about what is known as the conceptual framework. Okay, give the title conceptual framework, and under that start writing. I'm dictating notes upon the chapter of transparency and accountability. The first thing that you write over here is conceptual framework, and underneath that conceptual framework you start writing a paragraph. Please, we can start now. Start writing, please. The story of Indian public administration. The story of Indian public administration. The story of Indian public administration is. The story of Indian public administration is governed by. Story of Indian public administration is governed by. Is governed by. Is governed by two models of bureaucracy. Is governed by two models of bureaucracy. Is governed by two models of bureaucracy. Comma. One is based on traditional bureaucratic principles. One is based on traditional bureaucratic principles. One is based on traditional bureaucratic principles laid out by Max Weber. Traditional bureaucratic principles laid out by Max Weber. Laid out by Max Weber. The other are inspired from the concept of good governance. The other are inspired from the concept of good governance. Good governance. Good governance. Comma, and the story is marked at the transformation. The story is marked at the transformation. At the transformation of. Stories marked at the transformation of. Stories marked at the transformation of. Weberian bureaucracy into good governance informed by democracy. Informed by democracy beyond elections. Informed by democracy beyond elections. Informed by a democracy beyond elections. Okay. Informed by democracy beyond elections. Clear? Now, next point, next paragraph, write down. Give the subtitle accountability. Let's start writing about accountability. Start writing. Point number 1 under this accountability. Point number 1. In the Weberian model, in the Weberian model, in the Weberian model, in the Weberian model, public administration as a component of the government, public administration as a component of the government, public administration as a component of the government, public administration as a component of the government must necessarily be, public administration as a component of the government must necessarily be insulated from democratic pressures. Public administration as a component of government must necessarily be insulated from democratic pressures. Insulated from democratic pressures. Must necessarily be insulated from democratic pressures. Full stop. Since the government already came out of the parliament in India, since the government already came out of the parliament in India, the ministers were held accountable. The ministers were held accountable by the parliament. The ministers were held accountable by the parliament. The ministers were held accountable by the parliament, and the ministers were held accountable by the parliament, and ministers were held accountable by the parliament, and the parliament was accountable to the people of India. Parliament was accountable to the people of India. Parliament was accountable to the people of India. But Parliament was accountable to the people of India. But public administration which worked under the ministries, public administration which worked under the ministries, public administration which worked under the ministries could exercise accountability towards the people, only through the ministers, could exercise accountability towards the people only through the ministers, and not by a direct interface, with the citizens. Not by a direct interface with the citizens. comma. Instead of a comma, put a full stop. Don't put a comma, put a full stop. The reason for such principle, as cited by Weber, was that public administration is a set of experts and will not do well if they are in the constant gaze of the public eye. Constant gaze of the public eye. So you can put this point in apostrophes. Constant gaze of the public eye, comma, which may lead to constant gaze of the public eye, which may lead to involvement or repulsion from the public. Which may lead to involvement or repulsion from the public. Which may lead to involvement or repulsion from the public. Lead to involvement or repulsion from the public. Okay. Next paragraph change. Oh, sorry. Instead of saying a paragraph, please put a full stop and write down. This form of accountability was known as vertical accountability. This form of accountability was known as vertical accountability. This form of accountability was known as vertical accountability. Full stop. Now, change the paragraph. With the socio-economic transformation in India, and the state largely occupying regulatory positions, a change in the way of thinking about governance. A change in the way of thinking about governance was initiated. Full stop. This led to include democracy. Not only at the level of elections, but beyond it. but beyond it, comma, with civil society with civil society with civil society participation with civil society participation with civil society participation in with civil society participation in the everyday activity of governance in the everyday activity of governance in the everyday activity of governance to keep a vigil and hold it accountable and transparent hold it accountable and transparent hold it accountable and transparent hold it accountable and transparent, full stop. In the 1990s, the RTI movement in the 1990s, the RTI movement originating from Rajasthan initiated this process, which has now changed the landscape, from vertical accountability, to horizontal accountability, horizontal accountability, which has now changed the landscape from vertical accountability to horizontal accountability. With increased citizens' participation in governance, on the basis of statutory rights, like right to information, on the basis of statutory rights like right to information, full stop. Okay, right, so we are here covering it out. Clear? ठीक है. Then you can give the next title, transparency. After accountability, write down a little bit about transparency. Write down. In the early period of independence, and in the early period of independence and until liberalization of Indian economy, in the early period of independence and until liberalization of Indian economy, liberalization of Indian economy, the government was the primary site. The government was the primary site government was the primary site for generation, collection and transmission of information. Transmission of information. Transmission of information, which it could withhold, which it could withhold, which it could withhold, which it could withhold, and not release in the public, and not release in the public, and not release in the public, except by a specific law made, except by a specific law made by the parliament, except by a specific law made by the parliament, except by a specific law made by the parliament, or except by a specific law made by the parliament, or the intervention of politicians, or the intervention of politicians. For example, the question hour, the intervention of politician. For example, the question hour, intervention of politicians. For example, the question hour. Full stop. For example, the question hour, full stop. Paragraph change the paragraph after this. Since the liberalization of Indian economy, since the liberalization of Indian economy, the status of government being the primary site, since the liberalization of Indian economy, the status of government being the primary site, government being the primary site of generating, collecting and transmitting information, of generating, collecting and transmitting information, of generating, collecting and transmitting information, generating, collecting and transmitting information, transmitting information, and the growing private sector and civil society organizations, and the growing private sector and civil society organizations, and the growing private sector and civil society organizations, growing private sector and civil society organizations, private sector and civil society organizations, were at par with the government, were at par with the government, were at par with the government in information, in information, in information, and thus monopoly over information, thus monopoly over information by the government, thus monopoly over information by the government had to give way, had to give way to transparency. Monopoly over information by the government had to give way to transparency. Monopoly over information by the government had to give way to transparency. Full stop. Take an example of this. Okay, now this is what you can call, this is a, what you can call, it's a private limited company as registered, but it is actually a kind of a citizens organization, a privately developed organization known as the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. Right now, it is one of the most brilliant sources of any data upon the Indian economy, and these people, they collect all the data upon the Indian economy in terms of its vital stats, all by their own senses. They don't rely upon the government data or upon the government method of collecting the data, the GDP, the employment ratio, the Gini coefficient, etc. All of these data, the government, which is supposed to be released by the government separately, is independently conducted as surveys by the CMI, and they release this data periodically upon their website. Let's take a look at this. They have all the data upon the economy of India, which the government could do, and all of this, the methodology for collecting this data is given in this. They are making public all the ways in which their formula, etc., are being used, and they have been one of the most important sources of economic data. Even the government of the states and the state departments sometimes have to rely upon the data published by the CMI to create your own policies. Okay, so for example, let's take a look at this. Inflation hits a 2-year low. They are taking a very clear side-by-side understanding of how the inflation is in terms of milk and rice. Take a look at this CPI inflation. Okay, ports traffic gets wind in its sails, right? So what is the traffic at the ports? This kind of a thing has been given by them. Okay, industrial activity turns around, manufacturing turnaround steers IIP. Take a look at this. Margins return, right? So you have this kind of a, amazing data which has been created by a private limited company. That's what basically transparency looks like, or what eventually leads to transparency. Let's say, for example, give you another example of how this instance works. Now, these are information which started, surfacing on the social media website Twitter. Okay, now this was at the time when, for example, India and China were having a bit of a face-off at Bhutan in the Doklam region, right? And the government was not clearly stating as to what the position of the Chinese army was, whether they had entered Doklam, whether they had started constructing bridges, etc., etc. Government knew this information, but government was not ready to divulge this information to the public. Now, you see very clearly here that private, researchers and private strategists and private, public policy think tank people, etc., etc., they started collecting information by the use of their own private satellites, right? And they started zooming in. For example, take a look at this. Following this, exclusive around Doklam is an expanded area visual that covers not China's encroachment into Bhutan, but also allows a greater understanding of how the sector has been reinforced over time to ensure the PLA's ability in maintaining its territorial claims, right? So this basically tells you about how this region, for example, has been taken up by the PLA, People's Liberation Army, and it is now dealing with this kind of a thing. Now, in the events when the government of India is not willing to, compromise this data or let this data come out very clearly, the private organizations are one step ahead in terms of collecting this data. So eventually there is no option left with the government but to themselves release the data, because if they don't do it, they will naturally or in some way or the other be taken out by the private organizations, and that kind of a thing is something we should all be understanding of in terms of transparency, right? This kind of a shift is what we are talking about. Clear? Now that we've spoken about transparency and we're dealing with transparency currently, let's take a look at the first point within transparency, which is the point of our discussion a little longish, which is the right to information. This is what we're dealing with, right to information, and I will draw the sub points of this. First, I'll give you the historical background of right to information. The historical background of right to information. After this second, I will give you what you can say the provisions of the RTI Act 2005. Okay, in RTI Act we will divide it in different categories. For example, we'll talk about let's say the procedure to file an RTI, the role of the PIO, Public Information Officer, the role of or the position of the Chief Information Commissioner, and along with it State Information Commissioner, and then we'll take a look at appeals which can be made if RPI is denied. Okay, so these are the parts that we can take a look at, and of course we can take a look at exempted information from the RTI. What are the informations which are exempted from the RTI? Informations which are exempted from the RTI, right? So these are the 5 points that we can take a look at. The procedure for filing an RTI, the role of the Public Information Officer, the role and power of the Chief Information Commissioner, Central Information Commission and State Information Commission, the way to file appeals against the orders in which RTI has been denied, and what are the items and categories which are exempted from being released under RTI. So these are the 5 parts under which we can cover the entire RTI. So 2 parts about RTI: historical background about the RTI Act, in which we take a look at the MKSS, the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, the organization which was at the forefront of making the reform of RTI come inside. Okay, and you have this kind of a situation in which we can take a look at these organized structures clearly. Okay, let's take a look at this. Please take a note of this RTI Act 2005, the 5 categories under which we will cover it is a kind of a synopsis of the right to information. Is one of the most important and in a way extensive parts of the entire chapter on governance. So we'll pay a little bit of an attention to the details on this round. Okay, please take a note of this synopsis before we start off. Right to information. Okay, we can begin with this now, right? Who are funding this type of private limited companies? Sometimes these are just citizens who are interested in a better governance. You know, people have all kinds of hobbies. Some like watching cricket, some like investing in poker, some like, you know, bird watching. Some people like to take a vigil upon the activities of the governance, and they're willing to put some money out for ensuring good governance. That's what they do. I know what you're indicating at. You're indicating at the foreign funding routes, etc., etc. Especially for the CMI, there are no foreign funding routes. It is not registered under the FCRA, therefore there is no foreign money which is coming into it. And by the way, when we are discussing with the NGO and the civil societies, we'll take a look at the entire structure of what you can call the FCRA, which is something that we'll, you know, try to understand as to how this is working. Okay, fine. So this is what we are looking at in terms of RTI. Now, yeah, we start with the first part, which is historical background. Please start writing about it, and I'll explain as we write about it. Please write down historical background. Give the first point under this historical background. We're writing in pointers. Historical background. Start writing. Point number 1. In historical background, point number 1. The Supreme Court in cases related to assets of politicians. Supreme Court in cases related to assets of politicians. Supreme Court in cases related to assets of politicians. Cases related to assets of politicians. Observe that right to know the details about candidates. Right to know the details about candidates existed for the voters. To make informed and empowered voting decisions. 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 Informed and empowered voting decisions. Full stop. Informed and empowered voting decisions. Full stop. Later on, the Supreme Court included the right to know. Later on, the Supreme Court included the right to know. Included the right to know under Article 19(1)(a). Included the right to know under Article 19(1)(a). Included the right to know under Article 19(1)(a). 19(1)(a). Included the right to know under Article 19(1)(a). 19(1)(a), which under Article 19(1)(a), which implied that right to information, is essential. Right to information is essential. Right to information is essential for right to freedom of speech and expression. Right to freedom of speech and expression. Freedom of speech and expression. Full stop. This created the judicial basis. Full stop. This created the judicial basis. This created the judicial basis. Created the judicial basis for. This created the judicial basis for. Created the judicial basis for. Judicial basis for RTI. For RTI. Created the judicial basis for RTI. Full stop. Next point. Created the judicial basis for RTI. Next point. Write down. The social movement in Rajasthan, the social movement for RTI, the social movement for RTI started in Rajasthan. The social movement for RTI started in Rajasthan. Social movement for RTI started in Rajasthan. Social movement for RTI started in Rajasthan. Where there were reports about corruption. Where there were reports about corruption. In the money allotted for the implementation of centrally sponsored schemes. Implementation of centrally sponsored schemes. In the money allotted for the implementation of centrally sponsored schemes for poverty alleviation. Centrally sponsored schemes for poverty alleviation. Centrally sponsored schemes for poverty alleviation. For poverty alleviation. Full stop. Centrally sponsored schemes for poverty alleviation. Full stop. Next point. Write down. The Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan. The Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, MKSS, led a movement to 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 demand the state legislature led the movement to demand the state legislature led a movement to demand the state legislature statutory provisions for RTI. 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 Full stop. Statutory provisions for RTI. Full stop. This led to the state of Rajasthan enacting the first RTI law in India. This led the state of Rajasthan to enact the first RTI law in India. This led the state of Rajasthan to enact the first RTI law in India. This led the state of Rajasthan to enact the first RTI law in India. RTI law in India. Led the state of Rajasthan to enact the first RTI law in India. Law in India, which was later followed by Delhi, Haryana and Assam, which were later followed by Delhi, Haryana and Assam. Full stop. In some time, RTI became a full blown national movement. Eventually leading to the enactment of Right to Information Act 2005. Eventually leading to the enactment of Right to Information Act 2005. Eventually leading to the enactment of Right to Information Act 2005. Also you can call it RTI 2005. Right to Information Act 2005. Also you can call it RTI 2005. RTI 2005. Okay. So this is the part about the historical background, right? So it's some few points that you have to remember with regard to the prelims examination here. One, that the first RTI was initiated into India by the judicial understandings. Okay, right to information was considered an important part of the right of freedom of speech and expression, because Supreme Court said, how can you express yourself freely unless you have right information? If you want to say something against someone, right, which is correct, how can you say it confidently unless you have the information to support it, information to evidentiate it, information to create a base for it? So if you don't have that kind of information, how do you do your rights in terms of exercising them clearly? So that's the first part. Then the social movement for RTI, which was started in the state of Rajasthan, as I have mentioned, the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, former IAS officer Aruna Roy, she had resigned from the IAS and she was one of the leaders of this movement. She was the one who organized the movement of the MKSS throughout the state of Rajasthan, on the reports of the district administration siphoning of money which was given to them by the central government for some poverty alleviation centrally sponsored schemes. And they wanted to know what is exactly that the government is up to. Give us the documents by which the money has been given to you. What money have you spent? Whom have you given to, etc., etc. So all of these things were supposed to be, in a way, given by the public administration, which was withholding within itself. And therefore this led to a movement of enacting the RTI law in the entire state of Rajasthan, which was followed by Haryana, Delhi and Assam. And then it became a full-blown national movement, eventually leading to the enactment of the RTI Act in 2005. Small historical background of the RTI Act. Okay, so that much we have taken a look at. Now Anil is asking the question as to what are the categories which are exempted from the RTI. I'll just give you an understanding of that. Let me just follow the pattern that I'm laying out before you clearly. I don't want to jump the pattern which is given over here. I want to go from 1 to 3, 4, 5 in a categorical manner. Okay. Right. So now I'm going to just take a look at the Right to Information Act itself. As I had mentioned to you that, for example, what are the acts? Some of you had asked the question, what are the acts we have to read for the GS2 paper? First is, of course, the Constitution of India, which is the most important thing that we have to read. Then the second thing that we have to read is the Citizenship Act. (1955). There are some provisions of the Citizenship Act that you have to read. Then there is the RPA 1951. That is one thing that we are taking a look at. And then there is the RTI 2005. These are the four laws upon which the constitutional questions are going to be asked. You will not have more questions in the paper of GS2 apart from any of these acts: the Citizenship Act 1955, RPA 1951 and RTI 2005. Right, so we have together covered the provisions of RPA 1951. In a similar manner, we'll go through the provisions of RTI 2005. Both of these are statutes which are forming the base coverage of syllabus in the governance paper. Okay, so let me just pull out the Right to Information Act as a bare act. Okay, so I'll just brief out before I start with the reading of the act. I'll just brief out the sections that we have to read in the RTI Act. Okay, so let me just grab a synopsis for it for you. The RTI Act we have to read properly. So let me just make a synopsis for what you have to read from the RTI Act. I'll put out the sections that we have to read. Okay, section 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 10. These are the sections we have to read from the first part. Then we'll have to read sections. We just take a review of it. Section 12, 13 and 14. That's what we have to read. We have to read a section on appeal, which is section 19 is penalty, section 20. Section 19, section 20, and section 24. Okay, these are the sections that we have to read in the RTI Act. Please take a look at these. Please take a look at these. Section 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 13, 14, 19, 20, 24. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 13, 14, 19, 20, 24. Okay, just let me also give a little description about these sections. Section 3 talks about RTI itself. Section 4 talks about, let's say, cataloging of information. Section 5 talks about the establishment of public information officers. Section 6 talks about procedure for filing RTI. Section 7 talks about response. Section 8 talks about exemptions. Section 10 talks about severability. Section 12, 13 and 14, they talk about the chief information commissioners, the central information commissioners, which include the composition and powers, etc., etc. Section 19 talks about how appeals can be made, and section 20 talks about penalties for not giving RTIs on officers who are responsible, and section 24 again talks about exempted organizations. It's a BA, where RTI does not apply. Okay, take a brief synopsis of this. Will become a kind of a comfortable thing for us to read the RTI once you have a basic idea of this in the start. Section 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 12, 13, 14, 19, 20 and 24. Okay, so until 8 and 24. If you want to answer this question immediately for yourself, download the PDF of the RTI Act and take a look at section 8 and section 24. This is where the exemptions are given. I will come to it categorically as I'm dealing with these things all together as one. Okay, please take a synopsis of the RTI Act. Okay, so we'll start with the provisions. Yeah, please, Anil, let me come to section 24. I'm going to be at section 24 and I'll explain to you what that implies. Now, just wait for some time before I can come and see all of these things, right? Categorically, we'll move together. Wait till I get to section 24. Okay, now. Take a look at the Act directly. You can all download a PDF of the RTI Act upon your mobile phones or your laptops, so we can take a look at it from there easily. Okay, first of all, let's take a look at section number 3. This is a part of the chapter 2. Chapter 2 says right to information and obligations of public authorities, right? That citizens have the right to ask for information and public authorities have obligations to provide those informations. And what can happen if the public authorities don't provide that information? What actions can be taken against those public authorities? Okay, so that entire structure is over here, the content of the RTI Act. Just take a look at section 3. Section 3 simply states that subject to the provisions of this act, all citizens shall have the right to information, right? So here it makes a kind of a statutory declaration of a right to information. Okay, it says that there shall be a right to information for all citizens as it is given, or the way it is given and provided in this act. Okay, so just put a first section to it in terms of understanding. You can write down section 3. I'm giving you notes simultaneously to the sections that we can cover today. Write down section 3. Section 3, write down, of the RTI Act. Section 3 of the RTI Act. Section 3 of the RTI Act states that Section 3 of the RTI Act states that all citizens must have all citizens must have a right to information. All citizens must have a right to information. A right to information subject to the current act. Subject to the current act. Subject to the current act. Comma. It is to be noted that RTI cannot be enjoyed. It is to be noted that RTI cannot be enjoyed by non-citizens. It is to be noted that RTI cannot be enjoyed by non-citizens. It is to be noted that RTI cannot be enjoyed by non-citizens. Cannot be enjoyed by non-citizens. Full stop. Okay. Now, then we come to section 4 of the RTI Act. Now, what I'll do is, let's say I'll follow this kind of a method for giving you the understanding. First, I will explain to you the content of the section and then you will read the section directly yourself. So, once I have given you a bit of an explanation about what it is, once you read the section directly as it is, you will get a sense of what the section would be about. Okay. So, let's say, for example, I write a section 4. Now, section 4 states this very simply, that let's say, for example, if this is first thing that the section states is that RTI is going to be applying to a public authority, right? The term that is used in this section is that a public authority. There must be a public authority to which the RTI applies. Clear? So, every public authority under section 4 must create their information, all the information that is being created by the public authority. Let's say for example, the government of India has given the Department of Agriculture certain amount of money, and the Department of Agriculture has taken the purchase of urea from the market from that money. Okay, so now the government department is entering every of all of these things onto the records of the government, right? What amount of urea has been purchased, from which supplier has it been purchased, from which, for which rate has it been purchased, and what is the quality of the urea, etc. All of this has to be documented and recorded, right? This record has to be kept along with the receipts and the money which came in, money which went out. Everything has to be taken out in a documented format, right? That's how the government works. It's a kind of a, government is a kind of a documentation agency that creates records of things very clearly. So if the Department of Agriculture is buying urea from a private manufacturer and then giving it to villagers in subsidy as a urea subsidy scheme, then it has to keep a record of everything that it is doing, right? What section 4 says is that a public authority, while it is creating its record, should make sure that the records are kept in such a manner that the basis, the information that is given in this should enable the accessibility through RTI. Meaning, what section 4 says is that public authority should maintain their information in proper catalogs and indices in such a way that if ever this information was to given out as an RTI to a common man, he is able to read it. That's what section 4 says, that all the public authorities should maintain their information in such a manner that it is not cryptic. Let's say for example, if there's some kind of a corruption scandal, right, and can be revealed by a piece of letter, but let's say the person who's writing a piece of letter has written it in shorthand. What does shorthand mean? Let's say for example, instead of a background, the person has written BG. You see the point? Instead of background, the person has written BG. So the point is that if I am looking at a document and someone has written BG, in which is meaning background, but he is saying that it is meaning something else, it is meaning badgering or something, because BG is cryptic. So he said that we only write in shorthand, we have not written what you are thinking you're written, right? So to avoid this kind of a miscommunication or this kind of a confusion with regard to the information which has been catalogued under the public authority, section 4 states that catalog and indices of information was meant to be maintained in such a manner that if in the case or in the event of a person applying for information from this, is asking for information, when he receives the information, he should be able to, as a common person of simple intelligence, be able to read the information easily, be able to access the information easily. So before starting about anything else, section 4 creates a structure under which every public authority has to create documents in such a manner that the documents can be easily accessed by common men. Not accessed meaning by RTI, but once they have the document through the RTI, they are not cryptic or concealed or obscured written, which have multiple interpretations. Clearly, specifically laying out in simple terms what things are happening over here. Okay, take a look at this section 4. Now you read it upon yourself. Section 4. Just read from here to here, from this part to this part. Just take a look at section 4 from this part to this part. every public authority, section, just take a look at this part, maintain all its records duly catalogued and indexed in a manner and the form which facilitates the right to information under this act, and ensure that all records are appropriate to be computerized, are within a reasonable time and subject to availability of resources, computerized and connected through a network all over the country on different systems, so that access to such records is facilitated. You see, so the point is that let's say for example you have what we are saying in section 4 is that first of all cataloging and indexing must be done properly, and then as soon as maybe this information must be computerized and through a computer network must be distributed all across the country. Let's say for example you have a Punjab National Bank, right? You have a Punjab National Bank which is a kind of a nationalized bank. Punjab National Bank has a branch in Delhi. Now some kind of a transaction happens in Delhi which could be bought under the RTI. Then the idea is to put this detail upon the computer and also circulate it to network across India, so that all the networks, all the branches of Punjab National Bank in Mumbai, in Chennai, in Kolkata, they can have access to the information which is over here. That's what section 4 here says about the obligation of public authorities to maintain, catalog, index and computerize and put it on a network all the information which facilitates the receiving of the right to information by people. Clear? That's the first part. Okay, now take a look at the second part. All the public authorities are supposed to publish within 120 days from the enactment of this act the particulars of its organization, functions and duties, the powers and duties of its officers and employees, the procedure followed in the decision-making process including channels of supervision and accountability, the norms set by it for the discharge of its functions, the rules, regulations, instructions, manuals and records held by it or under its control or used by its employees for discharging its functions, a statement of the categories of documents that are held by it or under its control, the particulars of any arrangement that exists for consultation with or representation by the members of the public in relation to the formulation of its policy or implementation thereof, right? So what this in a way thematically, let me get this point across. We don't have to read the entire detail and particulars, that's not important for the exam. Just get a sense of what section 4 says in subsection B. It says that all the public authorities have to, within 120 days from the enactment of this act, release a set of things in publishing, in terms of making it public by themselves, right? Which includes all of these things, the particulars of its organization, functions and duties, meaning why has the organization been composed, the powers and duties of its officers and employees, etc., etc. All of this information shall be released by the public authority so that it can facilitate the common person to understand the structure and the manner in which that public authority works or functions. You see the point? So the only way that you can make effective use of RTI is when you target it correctly to the right department. Now let's say for example, if my pension is not coming to my house, I am not sure as to which department is responsible for my pension. Let's say I don't have that kind of understanding. So once a function power of a public authority has been released, therefore it is possible for me to understand which department is dealing or is involved in deciding upon the functions of giving pensions to people, right? So that kind of a thing has been given under section 4. Clear? So that is about section 4, which is the question about cataloging information. So I am striking it out from here. Take a look at this. Okay, so we've covered section 3, which is RTI. We've covered section 4, which is cataloging and indexing of information and computerizing it, and public authorities have to release a certain aspect of this information upon their own. Okay, then we take a look at the next one, which is section 5. Section 5 states very simply the structure by which a PIO is given the position of prominence in the RTI. Okay, so what it says is that you have a public information officer. Let's say, for example, I'll give you an instance of this. Let's say, for example, if this is a government school, okay, this is a government school. Now, the person in charge of the government school is the principal, right? And then there is the vice principal, and then there are teachers, and then there is the clerical staff, and then there is a support staff. Let's say this is how the organization of this institute has been structured. What the RTI says is that one of the people over here, either the principal or the vice principal, people from a senior management in some way or the other, have to be appointed as a public information officer. Okay, one of the people over here have to be appointed as a public information officer, PIO, right? And it is the PIO who is supposed to handle the first receipts of RTI from citizens. Let's say, for example, if a person wants to file an RTI against the school with regard to the job given to one of the teachers in the school. Okay, if a person wants to find information that they think that one of the teachers has been appointed into the school by some kind of a corruption or favoritism, then this person can file an RTI asking the question about the merits of the teacher or the degree of the teacher, etc., etc. Now, this RTI, forget about whether it can be given or not. What we're discussing is, if this person has to file an RTI about this school, the school, being a public authority, must have a public information officer, which is usually the principal or the vice principal. So, principal or the vice principal has to serve as the public information officer, and they are the first receiving agents of a right to information application, and they are supposed to take the look at the right to information application, and then based upon their understanding and judgment, they can take this information which is available in the government department and give it out to the person. Once the information has been given out to the person, it becomes a public information. Okay, so section 5 elaboratively, properly discusses the concept of a central PIO, a state PIO, etc., etc., but I don't think we will be able to go into that today. So I'll have to wait for the next class to elaborate upon this, but in the meantime, you can, for example, take a look at all the RTIs, the sections that I'm mentioning in RTI. Take a bare look at the Act, try to read the Act. You may not be very comfortable in reading the technical language, but just give it a try. Maybe some of these things can become a little bit comprehensible somewhere or the other. Okay, now with regard to the Official Secrets Act, Anil, again I'm insisting, please wait for the time to come. Unless I am able to explain to you the structure behind the RTI, you cannot necessarily understand how the secrecy and exemption of the RTI works. So please let me build up the correct context for it so that we can understand these questions in a proper background. Okay, Vishwajit, Bihar, a bridge broke 2 times. Which action taken against authority if this corruption link top to bottom? I'm not sure about the particular instance. Let me just read about it and get back to you about this. Sir, is not RTI contradict with right to privacy? It can, yes. There is a provision, for example, that has been given in section 11 of the RTI, which talks about third party information. This is where it comes, that if a personal or a private information about a person is being demanded in an RTI, it can be denied by the public information officer because it is relating to a private aspect of that person. So there is a possibility by which the information cannot be disclosed if it is relating to some personal or private matters. That kind of a situation is given to the PIO to deny the information. So that kind of a checks and balances system has been created effectively to make sure that the RTI is not leading to the violation of a right to privacy. Okay, so that's my time for today. Thank you for your time and patience, and cooperation. We will continue the journey upon the RTI and the remaining parts of governance in the next time we meet. Till then, Eid Mubarak to all of you, and have a safe holiday. I'll see you later. Thank you so much.